I'm Heather Freeman. I teach at the University of Kentucky, New Media. I love teaching, but the nice thing about that job is that it's research one, so I'm also afforded a lot of time to make art. Well, I've always drawn and stuff since I was a little kid. And when I was in high school and elementary school, my parents were really supportive of my art making. And then when I got to college, I didn't think I was going to really pursue art, as my life. I thought it was just something you did, but it wasn't something that's pragmatic. Both my parents were scientists, so I thought I was going to go into biology. My favorite medium to work in is probably installation. Second to that, my favorite medium that I actually end up doing a lot of work in is digital print. And I'm interested in incorporating digital print into installations. I started getting into doing 2D digital work when I started working in graphic design because I hated graphic design. I was really bad at it. So I had to figure out some way of making art out of it before I could ever get any good at it. And I got this sort of idea, just this sort of vision one day about a cowboy with an aura. I'd been thinking about Kirlian photography, that basically have a plate and you put some object against it, like a thumb or even a leaf or something, and you see this sort of aura around it. And there's all sorts of theories about how that works physically or spiritually. But I was really interested in that idea of Kirlian photography as being this overlap between hard science and mythology. There's scientific bases for how it works, but then there's also these sort of spiritual, mythical ideas about what's actually being photographed, your aura, your spirit. So I decided that what I really wanted to do was capture the aura of these cowboys from cinematic history, like the Lone Ranger or John Wayne or Clint Eastwood. And I wanted their aura to be both this representation of the character that the actor's playing, but also the actor themselves in some ways. And also to be this glorification. Auras are also sort of like halos. But I decided that my auras needed to be nebula because there's that interesting thing about space and that there's all these very romantic ideas behind both pop culture and pop science that you can experience them and read them or watch them. We have these photographs and experiences of it on a certain level, but you can actually be in them or be part of them. So I thought overlapping them was an interesting way to kind of get at that. I started doing video in high school. It was analog, so it was really slow and clunky and with a lot of glitches. And I was really interested in sort of using the history of the documentary and documentary techniques to kind of subvert my subject matter, which was parallels between the history of science and popular culture. And since then, I've kind of kept working with video as a tool for sort of recontextualizing information forms. Well, the first video I did in grad school was sex alchemy. I was really interested in how we validate fact and what constitutes fact and how that kind of overlaps with fiction and what validates then fiction. Are they polar opposites? Do they need each other? So I decided that looking at the history of science and then looking at the history of sort of popular culture forms is a really good way of doing that. So I sort of overlapped them and I kind of focused in on that and decided that alchemy was a really interesting science form because it was sort of a pseudoscience that led into modern chemistry. And so I overlapped that with pornography and started to try to find analogs between them. So in sex alchemy, I just kind of use it as a tool to break down logic and logical arguments. So, for instance, the first part in sex alchemy starts off talking about goldfish and how early alchemists were trying to create gold out of lead, and instead they kept coming up with these lusty goldfish. But the way I started that was I talked about certain facts involved in goldfish biology. For instance, that they have a cloaca, both the male and the female, and one's for the excretion of sperm, the other for eggs. And I based it with a little bit of fact at the beginning and then gradually broke it down into absolute fiction. And then the second part of that was the circumference of Letitia Casta, was looking more at logical arguments that sort of drifted off into tangents, speculating what's the likelihood of you basically being seduced by Letitia Casta, who's this gorgeous model. And the likelihood is very slim, but then they were talking about, well, if this did happen, what would you do, And then it ended up degrading into these arguments about, what makes a really good salad, or how do you know that a salad is better for you than pizza, or what if you could photosynthesize pizza? So it became this sort of absurdist thing, and then the last one, plum cake and its relation to the CNS, was basically this completely absurdist structure, where I took the old poem about the lion and the unicorn were fighting for the crown. The lion beat the unicorn all around the town. Some gave them white bread, some gave them brown, some gave them plum cake and drummed them out of town. So I used that structure, which always struck me as bizarre. Like, I still don't understand it to this day, what that poem is supposed to be about. I mean, I kind of do, but I kind of don't. And I used that to create this sort of weird little world where this plum cake was domineering everybody and everything, and the lion and the unicorn, and everybody was sort of surging up against this plum cake. And it was, you know, completely sort of abstract and absurdist. But I was using that as sort of a structural end to this thing that began with hard science and became complete fantasy. The pieces that I did before that, the one that kind of was the most important to me was Erste Wolken am Himmel des jungen Glücks, which is about jealousy, and how in jealousy, it's this experience that we feel in relation to somebody else or something else. But in actuality, you're projecting your own insecurities onto somebody else. I mean, the experience is entirely your own. And it becomes this duality between one side of yourself that doesn't want to feel this jealous experience, the other side of yourself that does feel this jealous experience. And it's really the sort of tension in yourself, but something that you could project onto somebody else. So in Erste Wolken am Himmel des jungen Glücks, I literally made two different characters who was essentially the same person having this duet, and I used Kurt Weill's song from the Threepenny Opera, which is called the Jealousy Duet, as the structure for that. These two women fighting over this man, but basically they're two versions of the same type of person. I left Jersey City and went to northwestern Pennsylvania for my first teaching job. That's when I started doing the love letters, because I started doing internet dating. You know, I'd had this really bad breakup when I left Jersey City. It's kind of comic, actually. My old boyfriend had been cheating on me for 3 years and had sort of, you know, it culminated with him cheating with me on a hooker, and then at the same time he was cheating on both of us with this other woman. I don't know, the whole thing was a big mess. Anyway, I started internet dating thinking, well, there's got to be some other freak weirdo artists like me out there. Some of them became these really sort of amazing torrid affairs, basically. You know, there's one guy who was a recovered heroin addict, and it got really intense and fiery. We had lots of phone sex and lots of internet sex, and and it got to the point where, like, okay, we have to meet each other. About a week before we were supposed to meet up, I get this sort of weird email. I'm not going to be able to meet you because I got arrested for my second DWI, and I need to talk to my lawyer, and I'll be in jail for like 6 months. And that was it. That was the last thing I ever heard from him. But after that, I was like, I have to do something therapeutic because this was just too bizarre. I mean, it's one thing when you get dumped, you know, at least you can give them a finger or something behind their back. But it's another thing when somebody just disappears on the internet who you've never even met, you know, and you've built up all these fantasies in your mind about who they might be. So I started doing this series of 5 love letters for sort of 5 of the major relationships I'd had. They were all sort of about these kind of distilled interactions between two people. I tried to figure out what the core issue in that particular relationship was and write a little poem about it, essentially, which then I turned into a video. So the Logophobia series really came out of beginning to explore how language functions on a finer scale, not so much in relation to popular culture, popular science, but more interpersonally. When I say a cow to you, you're going to think about a Holstein, and I'm going to think about one of those, you know, shaggy Scottish cows or something. But at the same time, we both understand the meaning of cow, and we both understand what a cow is. But at the same time, the image in our mind is different. Whereas if I show a picture of a Holstein, I'm going to think cow, and somebody in Germany is going to think Kuh, and somebody someplace else is going to think burger. So there's limitations that overlap between language and image, but then there's also possibilities that begin where those limitations come. You know, what happens when you just say to somebody, I love you, and you realize that really has no meaning beyond the logistical and historical meaning of those words. What that feels like for one person, you'll never know. But that limitation is inspiring. I mean, it's energizing in how frustrating it is. So that's really fascinating for me. And that's kind of where the Logophobia series came out of. I make art to survive. I make art because I have to. I mean, I've tried to not make art. I mean, I really seriously have when I lived in Germany for a year. But I ended up making drawings on the back of my door anyway. Sometimes I wish that I were a hard scientist or in public health or something, doing something pragmatically useful like curing cancer, but, you know, I don't think I could not make art. I want to try to give people something. I mean, I hope I can. I don't always know if I do. A lot of the time, I'm afraid I don't. So, I mean, otherwise, if you're just making art totally for yourself without the audience in mind, and I hate to say it, it's kind of like masturbating in the bathroom. You know? Not doing yourself or anybody else that much good.